Welcome back to the YouTube studio at the Munich Security Conference. My name is Marvin, and I have another interesting guest, really interesting guest with me, David Miliband, President of and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, actually. Welcome.
Nice to be here with you, Marvin.
Nice to meet you, and great to have you here at the studio, actually.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk to you about public-private partnerships. The USA actually is having, well, I don't want to say troubles, but they kind of wrote back their programs and donating money to programs, rescue programs. Which importance do PPPs, as you call them, public-private partnerships, which role do they have in the future, do you think?
That's an interesting place to start. I mean, the International Rescue Committee is a non-governmental organization. So we're born of civil society. We were born out of the mind of Albert Einstein, actually, who was a refugee from Germany in New York. And I think that the essence of a public-private partnership, I don't know what context you're thinking of this, is that we're trying to get the best of social value from the public sector, but the best of entrepreneurialism from the private sector.
Yeah.
And we know that social value can go wrong, entrepreneurialism can go wrong, but we want to get the best of both. In the work that we do, we help people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster. So we work in conflict zones. Sudan is a very good example of a conflict zone. We're working Ukraine. We work to help people who flee but stay within their own country. So they're called internally displaced people. So Syria would be a good example of that, the work we did in Idlib in northwest Syria, 1.5 million people driven into the area. We work with refugees and asylum seekers. We do that work in Germany as well as in countries like Ethiopia, which receives refugees. South Sudan receives refugees from Sudan. Bangladesh receives Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. And we also support host populations because if a lot of refugees arrive in your town, you need support for the host population. And every part of that requires a public-private partnership, really.
Yeah. Then what challenges do they have? Because you mentioned before that you are actually a public organization, but the PPPs, what challenges do you face?
There are challenges about risk, not because the public sector doesn't like risk, but the private sector embraces risk. So in the social sector, I think that the embrace of risk is really important. I mean, if our innovation fund doesn't have failures as well as successes, it's not radical enough, it's not challenging enough. So risk is a very tricky issue where public-private partnership struggles, I think. Capital and the allocation of capital is tough for the public sector, but it's second nature to the private sector. In the social sector, it's hard because a lot of our work is funded by short-term grants, and actually you need to think medium-term at least for some of the challenges. You know, how do you sustain Syrian civil society groups through 10 years of civil war? That's a medium-term problem, not just a short-term one.
I'm just imagining that it must be quite difficult to handle those privately and public, relationships, because at the very core, the private sector wants to make money in the best case, and sometimes maybe give up on social standards.
But to be fair to the private sector, they talk a lot about CSR, corporate social responsibility. I always talk to say, no, think about corporate social results. Don't just think about responsibility, because that's about inputs, if you like. Think about results. That's about outcomes, which is really what the humanitarian, we're a humanitarian organization. Maybe it's worth saying that for the benefit of your viewers, that a humanitarian organization is bound by principles of impartiality, independence, neutrality. And the conflict is, in a way, a shield for us against pressure from different conflict actors, and above all, the principle of humanity, which is trying to make a difference.
I'm just wondering what let's say companies at the very core and the very end look at, right? If they do not make money, if they're not financially sustainable and feasible, like how would you convince them to then raise?
Well, it's not my job to run their business, and if it's a failing business, then I can't save the business. If it's a successful business, I would say, which bottom lines are you meeting in addition to your profit-making bottom lines? Are you meeting a social bottom line, an environmental bottom line, an employee bottom line? And employees are important in this because they are demanding from their employer, what are you doing to create social value, not just private value? And I think that's important because employees can shift businesses. we're seeing a bit of a backlash. We're seeing a lot of private companies saying, well, I'm facing a climate backlash, but the climate crisis is clearly here.
Yeah.
I mean, the places that we work, the average rise in global temperature in central sub-Saharan Africa is well above the 1.5 degrees that is the global average.
Besides all of those PPPs.
What made us want to talk about PPPs? Well, it doesn't feel like a very, I don't know, YouTube-ish topic. I don't know.
You know, but the audience is actually quite well informed.
Oh no, but you can be very well informed, but not want to. I mean,
well, I think why the topic is interesting, because a lot of countries, or the biggest country, economy-wise, the USA, is stepping back from donating money in it, and
I see. So you see that as a public-private
issue. and seeing that sort of as a problem. But besides that, what I'm also interested in is which crises are there? Which crises do you cover, and do you see which actually are kind of forgotten, though, or like people don't like to talk about as well?
Well, so the headlines are about Ukraine. The headlines are about Gaza.
Yeah.
The top 20 humanitarian crises in the world. Your viewers can just click rescue.org and they'll see our emergency watch list. Top of that is Sudan, because it's the largest humanitarian crisis in the world and it's a virulent conflict at the moment. Syria never dropped off our emergency watch list, never dropped off our top 20, even though for the last 5 years people have been saying the war's over, Assad's won. Actually, the situation there was quite dire. 16 million people in humanitarian need in Syria, and the government's just fallen. So it's been a pretty massive change. I think that when I mentioned the Rohingya who'd fled to Myanmar, from Myanmar to Bangladesh, I think that's fallen off the headlines. So that's an interesting one.
Quite honestly, I haven't heard about that in 2 years' time.
Wow.
In my,
does it ring a bell from when
it does.
1 million people were driven out of the country?
Yeah, but like recently, it's actually not been covered, at least not by bigger media outlets, because they're just different topics, which might affect, like in my case, Germany.
Well, I mean, this is a surprising one and is a controversial one, but Afghanistan has become a bit of a forgotten crisis. From 3 years ago, it was in the news. Now it's out of the news. A lot of people don't want to talk about it. We have 2,000 staff members working there, including women, 1,000 female staff members. So that's an interesting example of a forgotten, quote unquote, forgotten crises. And part of our job as a non-governmental organization is to raise awareness as well as raise money so that we can make a difference in the places that are quote unquote forgotten.
And I think it must be harder, right? When those kind of conflicts or crises get forgotten and when people talk about them less, for you to then raise the money and make actually a difference.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But we always say we stay even when the headlines don't. And we try to have sustainable funding. We try and persuade our donors to make multi-year commitments because very few of the most acute humanitarian crises are resolved within 6 months or 12 months. The most likely outcome is further conflict. 70% of today's 59 civil wars around the world are the return of previous conflict. And one of our diagnoses is that one reason the world is unbalanced today is that the balance between diplomacy and military power is out of whack. That diplomacy is in retreat, that hard power is on the up. And that explains why you get the cycle of conflict.
Interesting.
I mean, after all, if you think about Ukraine, the invasion of 2022, of February 2022, there was a previous incursion in 2014.
Exactly, 8 years before that.
Yeah, so
which has been even from 2014 to 2022, people talk less about it, right?
Well, that's why people now say the full-scale invasion.
Exactly.
Whereas 2014 was not full-scale; it was focused on Crimea.
Yeah. David Miliband, thank you so much for your time, for answering my questions about PPP, but also forgotten conflicts.
Yeah,
very interesting.
All right,
thank you
nice
for your
to meet
time.
you. Yeah, take care.
Thank you.